Hi, welcome to the Total Kit Car YouTube channel. My name's Steve Hull, editor TKC Mag and TotalKitCar.com, and yet another episode in the Total Kit Car History File series. Now, I realise that's an awful lot of Total Kit Cars to put in that first paragraph, but Total Kit Car is who I am, Total Kit Car is what I do, and Total Kit Car is what this is, so forgive me. Anyway, straight in, not going to mess around today. I've got a little window that I'm told by Neil that I need to do a video, or voiceover. So here we go. Going to look at a very interesting company that still exists not in its original form, but still exists to this day, that can trace its history back to 1972. Company called Christopher Neal Lotus. Now, before we start, lots of people, and I wish I had a pound every time I heard someone mention the name Christopher Neal as being one person. It wasn't, and it's caught a few journalists out over the years, authors as well, which is quite embarrassing, but I suppose it's an understandable mistake to make. There were two guys involved, Christopher Dunscombe, beg your pardon, and Neil Shepherdson. Both were Lotus enthusiasts, both loved the Lotus Elan, and both decided in early 1972 to pull their interests and to create a little company trading from the local village hall, I think, in Cheshire, around the Middlewich and Nantwich areas. They pulled their interest in the Lotus Elan, all things Elan, and were basically stripping poorly Elans and selling the parts, as is understandable to do. They quickly realised, though, that actually if they restored those Lotus Elans, they could probably an unusual situation where they could get more than the sum of the parts by restoring the original, and that's what they do. And they were buying and selling Lotus Elans, and that's how Christopher Neal Lotus, the company, sprung into life. Their first premises, they grew out of the old village hall, but they moved into an old woolen mill in a place called Bredbury in Lancashire. Now, I think, and I've been to Stockey a few times, but I think it could be a suburb of Stockport. Forgive me if it is, and I'm just a Southern Jesse who's got it all wrong again. But certainly Bredbury is not in. If it's not in Stockport, it's very near Stockport. How's that? And that's all due respect to the good folk of Stockey. Yeah, and that's where they went, and they did outgrow that quite quickly as well. But we'll come back to that. They really, in a nutshell, that sort of business about parts, and because they carried on with the parts, they became very well known. And in fact, Christopher Neal Lotus, as the name implies, became an incredibly well respected operation for servicing historic. I think Lotus classed them in the end as a historic dealer, a heritage dealer. Such was their knowledge base and their parts stocking ability. They weren't actually appointed a official Lotus Cars dealer until 2002, would you believe? 30 years after they were founded, but we'll come to that as well. But that's really how the CN Sprint came to be, really. I think around the early 80s, they discovered, really, I suppose discovered might not be the right word, but they kind of realised that Lotus Elans, good ones, or even average ones, were pushing over the £10,000 mark. Cool, imagine that, a decent Lotus Elan for 10 grand. Oh, where do I find one? I will join the queue, eh? And so that was sort of unprecedented numbers in those days. So they thought, hang on a minute, why don't we create something that looks very much like a Lotus Elan and call it the CN Sprint, which is how it came about. Much like George Robinson at Vegan Tune was doing with his Avanti, which is a brilliant car as well, by the way. It was really effectively a restoration kit for the Elan, because you had to have an Elan to build one. They wouldn't just sell you the kit without having an Elan, so they weren't interested in you sticking it on a Ford Escort or something like that. That's not what they were interested in. They wouldn't sell, for example, you, and I suppose I could really have stopped you, but they officially didn't sell you a Lotus badge for your bonnet of your CN Sprint either. You get a nice CN Sprint badge, but not a Lotus one, I'm afraid. And it was a good thing. It really was a good thing. There was a guy called Jeff Orton, Aughton. If I've murdered that pronunciation, then I'm sorry, Jeff. And he was like their marketing manager at the time, in the mid-80s. And he was quite clear. I mean, you needed a land to start with. There was still, at that time, there was still plenty of barn finder lands. Can please put my name down for one, as well as one of them as well, please. And he said that was kind of the raison d'etre, the whole sort of inspiration for the CN Sprint. Lotus purists, and I like Lotus purists. I kind of have an affinity with Lotus historic guys. I like historic Lotuses. I'm a big fan of historic Lotuses, and I've got some good friends involved in, well, that fraternity and also that business, because there's a big business still supplying Lotus parts to heritage customers. And I can understand why they got the slight hump when the CN Sprint came about, because what it did, and much like, I suppose, the Pilgrim Sumo did when it was a 4-cylinder kit only, it gave people that aspired and dreamt and dreamed of owning a Cobra but couldn't afford not only the real thing, but they couldn't really run to a V8 engined one. And so therefore the Sumo was a perfect way to scratch the itch that they had. And I suppose it was the way with the land, with prices at that time going over £10,000. Then when the CN Sprint came out, it gave people a chance to go and find a ropey old Elan chassis or an Elan and build their version of the Elan on it. The car, by the way, to avoid copyright issues, there was, I think the CN Sprint differed slightly around the rear wheel arch area, just to avoid Colin Chapman's ire and getting the hump with that. But I believe Neil and Chris got on very, very well with Lotus. But I think they wanted to keep it that way, really. So going back to the Lotus fraternity, they were slightly upset because they didn't see it as a proper Elan, and that's understandable, and I sympathise with that view. I've given the counter argument to that. It gave people the chance who aspired to an Elan to get on that sort of map, on that ladder, I should say. And I think Neil and Chris were quite aware of that, which is one of the reasons I think that Neil Shepperton, when I've driven a couple of CN Sprints, I'm delighted to say, but I drove the demonstrator, which you'll see here, in original black and white form when I drove it, and also in 2021 maybe, when it was up for auction. Looking beautiful, by the way, as you can see, the colour photo there, looking absolutely splendid. That was Neil Shepperton's demonstrator, and it wanted for nothing. Allegedly he used all brand new parts, because Christopher Neil Lotus could supply you new, they could supply you refurbished, they could supply you upgrade. And it was a kind of mixed bag of all of those things, really. And he wanted to show what could be done. And as you see, it is a beautiful, beautiful thing. And I really enjoyed driving it, actually. He went he went slightly away from the standard norm, I suppose, for the engine, which again was one of the things I think that upset Lotus purists, really. He used a XR3i spec CVH, which was pretty nippy. I think it only had about 116 horsepower, maybe. And it went very well. I mean, the whole car was great. And I think that raised its profile slightly, that car of Neil's, because it was a beauty. And I think that also kind of a little bit of quality control from their end. I think encouraged and hinted that people should take a little bit more time. I think there were people that were just using a ropey old chassis from a stricken Elan and pressing it into CN Sprint service, and that really wasn't the way to go. They really wanted you to refurb. But they could supply you a nice chassis, as long as you had an Elan to go with it. Initially, those guys at Spider Sport, now known as Spider Engineering, led by old Wiggy, were supplying the chassis for them. They supplied most of the historic Lotus chassis to this day. And then Jago took over. I think those two companies, Jago and Spider Sport, if you were a fledgling kit car manufacturer, as there were many in the 80s and early 90s, and you decided you'd like to make your car and become a car maker, offer it to other folk, chassis were a problem for many people. And therefore companies such as Spider Sport and Jago were there to help you, and they would supply you. They'd recommend the chassis for your project, and they would supply as many as you wanted whenever you wanted them. And they were very, very good quality. And they were kind of not fighting lunches, but they were competing, Jago and Spider, for the custom that was about. And there was plenty of business for both of them. And that's kind of where the CN Sprint was, really. And I always remember that Neil and Chris were very, very friendly. I see that when that car came to auction, by the way, it was 2019, I just referred to my notes when it came up for auction, and it fetched £22,000, all but a fiver, I think. By the time it appeared at auction, certainly someone had been looking after it. I don't know how many owners it had subsequent to Neil, but someone had been looking after it, because it was, as you can see in that photograph, in beautiful order. Someone had put a lovely set of Dunlop D1 wheels on it, which looked great, which is a nice addition. And also at some time, someone had grasped the Ford Zetec 2-litre silver top mantle and had transplanted that, what must have been quite an oily old CVH by that time, and stuck a Zetec in, which was a beautiful engine for that car. Okay, it wasn't a Lotus Twink, but it was a beautiful engine. I think that chassis, by the way, that Spider Sport chassis, was based on an Elan S4, their version of the replacement for the S4 chassis. Yeah, as I said, if you had a car that they wanted to make sure really that you'd refurbished it at least, and it was in good order, people just said it's fine, and they used any old banana chassis, I think, in some cases, which wasn't too good. Other engines, you could use the Twink. One at least had a Fiat Mirafiori 2-litre, which is a Fiat version of a twin cam, so that's a nice engine to have. And a lot of the customers went full crossflow route, which is understandable. Gearbox, full 2000E, Bullet, and of course full Type 9, which needed a suitable bell housing conversion. Excuse me, but CN Sprint could supply whatever you wanted. The company's current, and there are some staff still around to this day. Lovely guy, sales manager now. He was just a humble salesman back in the day. His name's Steve Jevons, really helpful chap, still around now. He was heavily involved in the development of the CN Sprint idea, and many would say he drove the project, really. He reckons, I spoke to him only recently, he reckons maybe 20 fully builts were supplied, and that wasn't really the idea of it, because it was a restoration kit, but they were happy to build one. I mean, I think there's Paul Mack, who still runs the workshop, parts department, beg your pardon, and another Paul, who's the workshop manager, so those guys are still in place as well, which is brilliant. Steve reckons there's about 140 restoration kits supplied. The kits were really very well. I mean, I think Neil has put up the sales sheets, flyer things that were doubled as brochures, and you'll see there. I mean, I've noticed they use pictures of a genuine Elan on the front, but we'll forget about that. But the kits were well appointed, and they were £2,500 plus VAT, which I think, allowing for inflation today, is the equivalent of about 5,618, which is great value. Excuse me, I'm going to cough again. I forgot the essential glass of water, so forgive me. And they reckon, using that £2,500 kit, that you could build a budget version for £4,500, which undoubtedly a lot of those early customers did, which is what upset other Lotus people. But I think you were going to spend more money on it when CN got hold of the control and not adopted the customers, but kind of wanted to find out what the customers were aiming to do with them, really. You still needed, the kit was well appointed, as I said, but you still needed to find and source a few extra parts, quite a few actually. You wanted stuff like various bits of suspension and brakes, some interior trim parts, some engine ancillaries, which I suppose is only understandable, some bright work, a whole exhaust system, stainless steel preferably, and some electrics. Of course, those parts just happened to be available from Paul Mack in CN's or Christopher Neal's parts department. Although you were free to go your own way, really, and certainly as people did with engines. So that's the CN Sprint. We've also, and I'd forgotten about this one, there was a second model from Christopher Neal Lotus called the CN Cabriolet. It was a bit different, this one. This was based on the Elan Plus 2, and it was a chop the roof off. That's a fixed head car, of course, and they were chopping the roofs off them to turn it into convertible, which was quite a popular option. They didn't just take an angle grinder to your A pillars and B pillars, C pillars. No, they did it nicely. Let's not forget they were very successful, very well respected Lotus specialists who valued their good association with Lotus, and were doing it with their blessing. And so they turned it in fixed head into a convertible, and the Lotus aficionados liked that one because I read one quote somewhere online that a chap said that it was a Lotus and it wasn't trying to be a Lotus, merely a revision. Prices were pretty keen actually, £995. But they encourage customers to go for a full refurb if the car was of a certain age, and maybe encourage people to have a new chassis or upgraded CN parts, of which there were many, as we've already talked about. And then maybe as many as 80 CN cabriolets were supplied. Excuse me again. I was looking through an old magazine archive, my massive magazine, kit car magazine archive recently. I stumbled across an advert, whole page for Christopher Neal Lotus in late 1981, advertising the imminent arrival of their new National Kit Car Centre, a 10,000 square foot showroom intended to be a sales emporium for selected second-hand kit cars. I must ask Steve Jevons about that because I'm not sure if that actually happened. One thing that did happen, definitely, was in late 1987 when a new arm to the Christopher Neal business sprung up, and it's called Christopher Neal TVR, which, as the name suggests, bought and sold TVRs and specialist parts. There wasn't so many TVR outlets around in the country as there were Lotus, so that was pretty popular pretty quickly, and they were sourcing cars and selling them all over the UK. 1990, Chris Dunscombe decided to leave the business, although it's a very amicable parting, I believe, and the company continued to trade as they had done. In 1992, a big change arrived when Neil Shepherdson, I don't know if he was approached or he sought this out, but he was appointed as a Toyota dealer and built a brand new purpose-built showroom, which they had, by the way, I'd forgotten to mention, they'd moved from the old woolen mill to one in Nantwich. But this one was slightly just down the road, and it was a much bigger premises. It's the one they're based in now, actually, to be quite truthful. And it served them very well, and it's a big site. They decided to change the name, as I think Neil decided, because Chris Dunscombe wasn't involved anymore. They should have a new name, so that's when they became Oakmere Group. No reason for Oakmere. I think everybody in around the business decided that it sounded good and it worked well. And then they soon began specialising in stuff like selected Mercedes-Benz, Porsches, Ferraris and Aston Martins. Generally high-end sports cars, really. And then they later acquired a Mazda dealer, a business somewhere in Cheshire. I can't remember where it was. I did know, forgive me. But they bought the business lock, stock and barrel and relocated it to the Oakmere showroom. So they're now traders. Mazda dealers. They've also picked up along the way a VW official servicing contract. Don't sell VWs, not brand new ones, not a dealer, but they are an official servicing point for Volkswagen customers. Tragedy struck the business in 2014. First of all, Neil was diagnosed with cancer, which is bad enough, but this was compounded by the devastating news of the death of his son Ben in a road accident in a Lotus Elise. Absolute tragedy. Neil had been putting up a very brave fight against that terrible illness and disease, or whatever you want to call it. What terrible is the word, definitely. But it hit him very hard, as it would. It didn't do his chances of fight. Well, it very much demoralised him, I believe, from what I understand. One thing he did do was he got rid of any Lotus representation on the Oakmere site. He just didn't want to be around Lotus anymore, understandably, I guess, with the tragic death of his young son. And so they stopped all Lotus activities. And Neil sadly died himself in 2014. Really nice man, Neil Shepherdson. And that's tragic, really tragic. But anyway, the staff rallied round. They realised they had a fantastic business that Neil had built, a successful business too, and the show must go on, and they carried on. And indeed, they within I think it was a year or so, in full agreement with Neil's family and his widow Louise, they decided that there was never any blame attached to Lotus or the Lotus Elise for young Ben's sad death. So they decided to bring Lotus back on board, and so the Lotus brand returned to the Oakmere Group's portfolio. As I said, 2002 they'd been appointed as official Lotus dealer, and they still are very much Lotus specialists, although Lotus of course do what Caterham do, and they sell direct, but they still are rightly in their place as being one of the country's leading Lotus specialist part suppliers and restorers. They also, talking of Caterham, they're one of 5 official Caterham cars dealers in the UK, and they also, like several of these, I think most of these Caterham dealers, they also represent Morgan, and a couple of them also represent Norton motorcycles. So they are still a proper specialist and mainstream car emporium is the word. Really good reputation. I met a chap at a show once, who just happened to, I was out in the car park looking at kit cars, as I do, and the guy had parked this lovely Porsche 911 turbo outside, and I thought I joked with him, as you do, about it being a Covin, which he laughed. Sometimes people don't, but he laughed, and he knew what a Covin was actually. And I'd asked him about his lovely 911 and got to talking, and he got it from Oakmere, and he said very, very nice things about Oakmere and about their reputation for great service. I think it was really quite nice to hear, because he genuinely was. I'd sprung it on him. He wasn't a plant or anything like that, but I'd sprung it on him and asked him genuinely, because I'm interested, as we all are, about cars. And he not only told me about his car, which he clearly loved. It's his first Porsche as well, the lucky boy, and was just happened to say not only was it a nice, pleasurable experience to buy the car from Oakmere, but once they got the sale, like many car dealers and want to forget about you, they actively were keen to look after him and the car. So that's great. And anyway, that's it really. Nice short one today. I think I've done it in about under 25 minutes, which is good. That's our roundup of Christopher Neal Lotus. Really, as I say, great company. And it's really brilliant. They've had some lows as well as the many highs, but it's fabulous that they still exist and are still doing such a grand job. And certainly in the case of the CN Sprint, a real sweetheart of a car, really. Anyway, wherever you are in the world, I hope you're having a fantastic day, and I really do appreciate you spending time visiting our site and giving us a chunk of your valuable time. Some people have told me that I send them to sleep at night. Now, I won't mention about that. But anyway, if you're listening to this with your headphones on, where you're drifting off into sleep land, then that's fine. But before you go, if you haven't already subscribed, if you could, I'd really appreciate it. Last count, I think 30% of the people that are watching or listening to these videos, or whatever you want to call them, only 30% subscribe. So we're getting a good load of traffic, but only 30% are subscribing. So we need to do something about that. So come on, click that subscribe button, hit the all, so you'll get every notification when every time we drop a video. Really, hark at me with the cool language. Not bad for a dinosaur, that. And anyways, yes, you'll be notified every time a new video is published, released, whatever you want to call it, launched. Excuse me. And hit that like button as well, and I'll really be grateful. Anyway, Steve Hull signing off, over and out, and look forward to welcoming you next time. See ya. Yeah, see you down the road.